Jackie from Sites Music School, and welcome to Violin 101. Today we're going to learn about the parts of the violin, and we're also going to talk a little bit about taking care of the violin. I tell my students that a violin is kind of like a baby, at least how you take care of it, right? You wouldn't leave a baby in a car, especially by itself. You wouldn't leave a baby, especially in a hot car or a cold car. If it gets too cold and dry, your violin can crack, which is going to be pretty expensive to fix. If it gets too hot and moist, the violin is glued together with hide glue, and that is heat and water soluble. And so what that means is if it gets too hot in your car and you leave your violin in the trunk or in the front, and that heat is beating down in the summer, it can come unglued. And it's funny, but a little crack or a little bit of unglue, you won't even necessarily even notice it has happened looking at the instrument. But what's going to happen is a crack will make the most terrible buzz you ever heard. And when it comes unglued, you get these kind of really funny sounds. It's even worse than a buzz. Sometimes it's like a really strange buzz. And my husband is a luthier. He works on violins, and he has special soap he puts on it, and he can see bubbles if there's holes, or sometimes he blows to see where the air is coming out at to find if the seams have come apart and it needs re-glued. So that's probably the number one thing I want you to remember. The number two thing is when you set your violin in the case, always set it so the violin is facing this direction and not so that the violin's top is down. I'm not even going to show you in a case because that's not good for the instrument. But you don't want the bridge, this part that holds up the strings, you don't want that upside down in the case because this bridge is not glued on. It's very movable. When you first try messing with it, you might notice it doesn't move super easily because it has the tension of the strings to keep it in place. But I'll tell you what, if it gets bumped or that violin case is even on its side and someone accidentally knocks it over, that'll move this bridge. And if the bridge moves side to side or up or down or it leans too much, it's going to change the pitch of your notes, where your fingers go. Sometimes the strings will be all the way off the fingerboard. Speaking of these parts I'm talking about, let's go through the parts of the violin. I think of the violin kind of like a person. So it has a back and it has a front, and some people call this part the belly. These parts here are the shoulders. This part is called the neck, and then this part up here is called the head or the headstock. This twirly part is called the scroll, and that's where you can see the artistry of the maker. So if you notice, if you're going to buy a violin on eBay or Amazon and you see that this scroll doesn't look very ornate, and maybe it looks not quite like a scroll, that might be a good sign that you might want to avoid that violin. Unless someone's making an artistic statement, right? Now, these four things here are called the pegs, and they work with pressure. They're tapered. So that means they're shorter on one side, they're a little smaller on one side, and they're bigger on the side where the turning part of the peg is. And what that means is when you turn it, you have to press in towards the peg box. One thing that happens when people are starting to tune their violin and they really have trouble with it breaking strings or it's slipping is they don't realize how hard they have to push in on the pegs. We'll have a lesson on that, and I strongly encourage you not to tune your violin until you've seen that lesson, because it's really simple with the pegs to break a string, and you don't want to do that. So you've been warned. Okay. The next part is called the fingerboard. That's this black part here, and that's where you place your fingers against the strings to make the different pitches. And a lot of people think this part here is part of the fingerboard. There's a little part right here. It's called the nut. It actually sets up a little higher than the fingerboard, and it's what holds the strings off of the fingerboard. Now, some new violins that haven't been set up, this nut might be the wrong size, or the bridge might be the wrong size, or hasn't been cut. If you get a nice violin from a violin shop, they will cut the bridge to fit the violin. So if you get any squeaks or squawks, a lot of times it can be this nut not quite being right, or if your fingerboard has like a little hump in it, or if your bridge is the wrong cut or position. So watch out for that. And then these parts here, these little holes, that's where the sound kind of comes into the violin and resonates in the hollow chamber inside. And then it comes out, these are called the F holes, and they look kind of like a fancy letter F. There's 2 of them, and you're gonna find most of the time if your bridge is set up correctly, it's gonna be very close to the notches in the F holes. Just kind of depends on the violin and how it's set up, but that's where that bridge should be. And then you definitely have you get the sides. Oh, one thing that's really interesting is this part here is called purfling. I don't know if you can see that line. There's some on the back too. That is actually inlaid in the violin on good quality violins. Some violins have it painted on. That definitely is a sign. Like if you see the purfling missing and it's just like it was painted, that's probably a clue that you have a lot less expensive quality instrument. Okay, if you look inside the F holes, on most violins, you're gonna find a label on the inside. It's gonna tell you who made the violin or what factory it came from, probably what year it was made, and also what size it is a lot of times. If you can't find that size on the inside, sometimes it'll say if you have a student model on the case, there'll be a little tag, or you can look up measurements online and it'll tell you what size you can measure with a measuring tape, and it'll tell you what size your instrument is. Okay, and then these are the strings. On this violin, there are 4 strings. Most violins have 4 strings. I have one with 5 as well. But the strings for the violin are G, D, A, and E. I tell the kids, giant dogs always eat, because giant is for the biggest string, which makes the lowest sound. And so G, D, A, and E. And then this is called the tailpiece. My husband collects these really cool flowered tail pieces. You can get old, these ones are super old. This one's definitely older than I am. And they have individual fine tuners. So these tuners are for if your notes are just a little bit out of tune and they need a minor adjustment. A lot of like fiddle players, more roots music players, you'll find will have 4 fine tuners. There are some great violinists that have 4 fine tuners, but a lot of real traditionalists will just have 1 fine tuner, and then they'll work with the pegs to tune in the other notes. But you're gonna find on the majority of student violins that you're gonna have 4 fine tuners. It just makes it easier to tune. I love the kind that have individual fine tuners. So if something goes wrong with one of my fine tuners, I can just get a new one that costs about $10, right? And so that's easier than getting a whole tailpiece. So if you have a very beginner student violin, you're gonna find out that these fine tuners are built in. Well, if they strip, they work like a screw so they can get stripped. If that happens, then you have to just buy a whole new tailpiece. So that's one thing to look out for. This part here is called the chin rest, because you're actually gonna find it's not so much your chin, but your jaw kind of rests in it. And then we'll also add a shoulder rest. And when I add this shoulder rest, it allows me to hold the instrument without using my hands. And that's very essential. It's very essential that I can hold the instrument without using my hands, because that frees up my hands to play the instrument. So that's something you really want to work on. And the next video is going to show you how to attach the shoulder rest and how to hold the instrument with no hands. Okay, I'll see you in the next one.